Hi, welcome back to Broken and Brilliant. I'm Carrie O'Toole with Carrie O'Toole Ministries. Today I've got a Skype guest with me from the western part of New York, Dale Ingraham. Dale, welcome.
It's good to be here, Carrie.
Thank you so much. Dale and I met at the American Association of Christian Counselors World Conference this last year. And Dale, you had a booth there introducing your
Yes.
ministry. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, my wife and I founded Speaking Truth Love Ministries. The early stages were about 9 years ago. We've been a 501c3 since 2008. And our ministry grows out of my wife's story. My wife was abused by her father from the age of 10 until she was 18 years old. And we made a lot of mistakes in how we dealt with or actually how we didn't deal with her dad. Faith and I met at Bible College here in New York State. I graduated in 1983 and my wife graduated in 1984. And actually her dad graduated from the same institution back in 1961.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's pastored little churches all over this part of New York State. And he started raping and molesting Faith when she was 10 years old. And it lasted until she was 18. And he was a pastor during that whole time. Since we started our ministry, we know that there are other victims. You know, we kind of assumed that she was the only victim. And since she was out of the house, we had hoped he had repented. And, you know, you think of any sin with Christians, you confess it, you repent of it, and you get victory and you move on. But sexual abuse is a very powerful addiction. And it's not that it's impossible for an offender to change, but it's unusual for an offender to truly change. We just seldom see it.
Wow. So, you know, I don't want to get into details or anything like that. I just want you to be able to share what it is you would like to share and what your wife would like you to share. What interests me, Dale, is that you're a man speaking out on this topic. And I think that's unusual. Can you tell why is this so important to you? How has this impacted you and your marriage and your relationship with your wife?
Okay. Yeah, I know, looking back, I know I made a lot of mistakes in terms of we never dealt with her dad. What woke us up was 10 years ago. Faith's dad abused one of his son's foster daughters. And that's when we actually had to deal with him. He was a member of our church, which is a really long story.
Wow.
But yeah, he and mom were members of our church. And I was always uncomfortable with him because his language, the way he would interact with women seemed inappropriate. But I never had anything specific other than I knew he had abused Faith. But then 10 years ago when he
Which, by
molested
the way, that should be enough.
Correct.
Yeah.
What I know now, you know, I'm horrified by what we didn't do.
Right.
For,
But you
for
live
most of
and
my ministry.
learn. Yeah, I mean, you didn't know.
Yeah. So the catalyst, I think, for our ministry was when we really woke up to this 10 years ago, and I had to go and confront Faith's dad, not only with what he had done to one of his son's foster daughters, I confronted him that night with what he had done to Faith. And that was a wake-up call for us. Dad clearly was not repentant. He was blaming everybody else but taking ownership of his own sin. The other thing is Faith is the one that began to do all the research. She was reading the books and going online. So she would digest the information, feed it back to me, and we were both just absolutely shocked at the statistics, at the reality. And I realized, you know, I was like 99% ignorant about the issue of abuse. I could have given you a definition, at least a partial definition. But the only exposure I ever had to any kind of teaching, and it really wasn't teaching, it was news about abuse, would be like someone from New York City down around Central Park. You would hear about a jogger or someone on a bike, some guy, some stranger jumps out of the woods and rapes her.
Right.
Okay, so that's my general concept of sexual abuse. I knew it happened. Even knowing that Faith's dad had abused her, and I guess, there'd be a few other stories along the way that I could say, okay, I'm aware of that. Completely ignorant, though, about the scope of abuse, how often it occurs. It occurs right under our noses. It occurs in public. It occurs at family get-togethers. It occurs during church services. All of that stuff was just information we didn't have. And so our initial thought was, as we began to be enlightened about the issue, was, we have to get this into churches. We have to go and help believers, not just church leaders, but everybody, really understand this issue. Most people have some knowledge, like I did, that abuse is there, but they still, for the most part, the vast majority of Christians do not understand the extent of abuse and the risk that their kids are at in even public places.
Wow. So as you're talking about your wife, did you know going into your marriage that she had been abused and that this was an issue? How did that come up between the two of you?
This was a very painful thing for Faith to go through. And I think probably any survivor, is terrified at the thought of dating, and then how am I going to tell my mate? And of course, it may be a lot of guys, a lot of boys are abused. So,
and I want to just say also that Faith has given you permission to speak on this. As we're talking about it, I'm just thinking about anyone out there who may have been abused themselves. And I want them to understand.
Yes.
You and Faith wrote a book. You have a ministry together. I met you. That's where we have the connection. And I find it very interesting and appealing that there is a man speaking out on this. But Faith it's her story, but she's given you permission.
Absolutely. And we just were at a conference in Greenville a week and a half ago, and Faith shares her story. She shares it in churches on Sunday mornings as God gives us the opportunity. She shares it at all of our conferences. So all of what we're going to be talking about are things that she shares openly.
Okay, great.
But this was very painful. Going back to college, we were getting serious, but I knew there was something wrong. It's like there was an invisible wall there. And eventually, Faith was able to tell me, because she knew that I was going to be proposing to her soon, and somehow it had to come up. And so it was a lot of crying, a lot of heartache. She didn't tell me the extent of the abuse. I didn't ask. I knew that her father had sexually abused her. And from time to time in our marriage, it's going to come up because it creates all kinds of issues.
Can you talk about that just for a minute? What do you mean by all kinds of issues?
Well, I think that probably the most obvious is going to be with intimacy. So many things trigger survivors that, like, I'm not a survivor of sexual abuse, so the things I would have no clue would trigger. It could be something that I would say. It could be the way I would say it, something that I do. And of course, just intimacy itself can be very overwhelming. We have dealt with survivors, talked with survivors who basically have little, if any, intimacy in the marriage. And in some cases, the spouse, in maybe many cases, they don't even know what's happened because people have not been able to open up and share. So it creates all kinds of ripple effects within the marriage.
Right. So as your marriage progressed, as you had been married for a while, did things start to get better? Did they get worse? Did they just stay the same? And how were you able to talk about this more thoroughly?
Well, I would say things stayed the same. I mean, we had a good relationship, but the way Faith describes it when she shares her testimony is that when she was 10 years old, she died emotionally. And it's a survival mechanism. Her abuser is her father, who's in her home.
Right.
And he's looking for any opportunity to abuse her that he can get. And for a child, the only way you survive that kind of abuse is you just shut down emotionally. It's like you're there, you're alive, but Uh, every survivor is a little bit different. In Faith's case, she describes herself as not being angry, but she was not happy either. It was just almost a
Like
deadness.
flat line
Yeah,
almost, yeah.
exactly. So that carried over, into the marriage. We've always had a good marriage. We've communicated well. We enjoy doing things together, that kind of thing, which is really helpful. Um, Little things like holding hands,
Mm-hmm.
really important. And it's a safe physical contact.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big help. Um, but even with our kids, when Faith finally came out 10 years ago, she was going to testify against her dad in court because this
Wow.
incident did go to court. So she wrote a letter to her mom and her 8 brothers. She also had to talk to all 5 of our children and tell them what had happened to her because this was going to be coming out. So that was a difficult process. And one of my sons made the statement when Faith told him, he said that explains a lot, which surprised us. You
Mm.
don't realize the post-traumatic stress syndrome,
Right.
it creates secondary post-traumatic stress syndrome, and you don't realize the impact it has on us. And just the fact she was a great mom, she was loving, she was caring, but not the excitable,
Mm.
really overly happy. And so they missed those highs. They didn't really have the lows of an angry mom. She was very kind and caring, but it definitely impacts a lot of aspects of marriage and family.
Right. And kids are very perceptive. They pick things up.
Yes.
So even though you hadn't talked about it, once you did talk and they said that explains a lot. That's
Yeah.
so interesting because even if they don't know what's going on, they know something is going on. It may not be what they're seeing in other friends, families, or
Yes.
whatever. So, where are things at with your whole family at this point? Because you've written a book and you have this
Yes.
ministry.
The ministry has helped Faith immensely. You were asking just a minute ago about how things have been, and they've been pretty level. But when Faith came out with her story, she's cried a lot more, but her emotions are coming awake. And
Mm,
we do our ministry very much as a team. It's taken a while to get there, but we started out, Faith would share her story. I would do all the teaching, the presentations that we do. Now we do all the presentations as a team, and she's very comfortable up front speaking, even though it's not her personality to do that.
right.
She looks forward to that opportunity. So she's really blossomed in the last 7 or 8 years. Our children are behind us 100%. It's not easy for them to, if we're in the car and the kids are there, we try not to talk about the ministry all the time just because we don't want to overload them.
Right. It's a deep, heavy topic
It is.
for them to
It
have
is.
to be listening to all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard for them to contemplate, what Faith's dad did to her.
Right.
And
Because this is
so,
grandpa.
yeah. Yeah. And none of them call him that. So
Mm.
and the thing is, and I guess in some ways, I mean, I call him dad. I always have. He doesn't deserve to be called grandpa because his behavior, even though he claims to be a Christian, which is a whole nother area, I'm convinced that he's not a Christian. I see no evidence of the Spirit in his life at all. He has done this for much of his life. I would say all of his ministry, just in different reports of other people who have been abused by him. And yet there's no shame. There's no sense of guilt. He thinks he's fine. That's telling me the Holy Spirit's not there.
Wow. It's just so amazing, that this is somebody that pastored a church.
Yes. Yeah, actually quite a few smaller churches around our area. I don't know exactly how many over the years, but 10 years ago when he molested one of his son's foster daughters, we made sure it was in both of our local papers because I I told the one, and Faith's other brother contacted the other paper. We both said that people need to be aware
Mm-hmm.
that this guy's involved in this, because many people and many kids have been exposed to him over the years.
And so he has never been arrested, or what's
He
happened
was
with that?
the only case that he's ever been actually prosecuted for was the one 10 years ago. He wound up pleading guilty, and I think largely because he knew Faith was going to testify, what we refer to as her niece. She was going to testify on behalf of her niece. And with that information, it put more pressure on Dad to plead guilty, which he did. He did no jail time, unfortunately.
Hmm.
He was 72 years old when this happened. So he's 82 now.
And has lived
And
free his whole life.
he has. He has. I actually turned him in for a probation violation about a month or so after this happened. He attended a birthday party where there were kids, gave the kids hugs,
Hmm.
was not supposed to have contact with them. So I turned him in, and it was rumored that he might have had to spend a few weekends in jail. But basically, and I never found out for sure because we have no contact with him.
Okay.
Faith's mom, she has some contact with her, but she refuses to let Faith talk about the abuse. She doesn't want to deal with it at all. So it's just like, let's not talk about it.
Wow. And that happens a lot, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
What have you learned about that? Why does that happen?
There's no rational explanation, because it's like the norm. What we see with Christians, the norm is to embrace the offender and reject the victim. And that doesn't make any sense. We should be embracing the victim, reaching out to help, show love and comfort. We should be holding the offenders accountable for what they've done. And I don't know if it's the way Faith describes it. She says that it's easier to believe a child is lying than to believe your husband or your father or your pastor or youth leader could do this horrible thing to a child. Some of it may be that, people they just can't grasp.
Right. Can't wrap their heads around it, or
yeah. But the concept of children lying, well, that's easy to understand. I think a lot of people go in that direction. I think a lot of people, even people who've gone through abuse themselves, they're so traumatized by it, they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to think about it. And so we're just going to pretend it's not there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But a rational explanation, it's hard to figure out.
Right, right. We're going to come back and do another podcast here in a minute that talks more about your book and your ministry. But I'm just thinking about anybody out there who is either the victim of abuse or somebody who knows somebody who has been abused. What would you like to say to them if you had just a few minutes to talk to them?
If you're not a victim, but you know somebody who's gone through abuse and you want to help them, the best thing you can do is be there for them, believe them, listen to them, reassure them that the abuse was not their fault. That is a huge thing. Survivors of abuse need to be validated. They need to be encouraged and continually reminded that God does really love them, and they are valuable in His sight, and that this was not their sin. This was not their fault. This is something that was done to them. Those kinds of things we need to do over and over. We have to be patient. We don't try to draw information out of a survivor, but encourage them that if they're ready to talk, you're willing to listen. And just be a good listener. Don't act shocked, which is hard, hard to do that. But be able to listen and not question, not judge, not try to fix them necessarily. Just be there for them. It's probably the best thing you do. If you're a survivor,
mm-hmm.
I do a message out of Matthew 18, the first 14 verses, that is about the little children.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a survivor, you need to know that God dearly loves you, and he does not blame you for this sin. It is the fault of the offender. And in that passage, Jesus just really shows his heart to the little children, and he shows his anger towards those who would harm the little children. And I would just encourage survivors that God does love you. He does care about you, even though you may not feel like he does. He does.
And
And have hope.
do you have part of that, a verse or two from that you can, what are you speaking about exactly? I think I know, but I would like
Yes.
you to be able to say that for people who don't maybe have a Bible.
Yes. In verse 1 talks about the disciples are discussing who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, which I describe as the classic man thing. Okay, that's what we're focused on. Who's going to be the biggest? Who's going to be the best? Jesus takes a little child in verse 2, sets him in the midst, and he says, unless you're converted and become as this little child, you're not even going to see the kingdom of heaven. And then he spends some time in verses 2 and 3 talking about children are like a model of salvation. It's their faith, their humility, maybe their innocence. Jesus doesn't elaborate on it a lot, but this little child is like the model for salvation. And then Jesus talks about if you receive one of these little children, you receive me. Now, that's fascinating for Jesus to say that, for God to say that if you receive a child, it's just like receiving me. And what I really try to bring out in that is that God takes it personally. Whenever we encounter a child, whether it's good or bad, how we treat the child, God takes that very personal. If we bless a child, we help a child, we minister a child, it's just like doing it to Jesus. Then he shifts gears and he goes into those who would harm children.
Right.
And he said it would be better if a millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea than that you should harm one of these little ones or cause one of these little ones to sin. And Jesus doesn't say in that passage or in the Luke 17 passage, better than what? But the implication is better than when I get my hands on you. The offender, the person who would harm a child, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, the emotional abuse we see of many children, the neglect, it's just like doing it to him. And Jesus is saying, when I get my hands on you, it would have been better for you if you had a millstone thrown around your neck and thrown in the sea than what I'm going to do. So it's very, very forceful. Mm-hmm. And then he goes into these kind of obscure verses. He talks about if your hands offend you, cut it off. If your foot offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. He's still talking about abusers. He's talking about people who would harm children. He says it would be better for you to go to heaven or to enter life halt or maimed than to be whole, have a whole body and cast into hell. What I think he's saying there in those verses is if your tendency is to harm children, you better do everything you possibly can to keep from harming these children because you will answer for it. Then he goes to verse 10. He's still continuing talking about the children and talking to the abusers. And Jesus goes to verse 10. He says that the angels of these children always behold the face of my Father who's in heaven. Now, he doesn't elaborate to say, well, what does that mean? But he says angels plural. I don't know if that means every child has an angel or there's a group of angels watching over the children. But what does it mean that these angels are always beholding the face of my Father who's in heaven? What I get out of that is they're there reporting to the Father about the children. God absolutely knows what is happening with the children. He is outraged by it. He's brokenhearted over it. He knows, he cares, he's paying attention. Now, I know there has to be an ache in survivors' heart about why didn't God stop the abuse?
Right.
And we could come up with some philosophical answers to that, but nothing that's really going to, in a meaningful way, answer that. Mm-hmm. God is going to deal with the offender. He's going to those who have been abused. But after verse 10, Verses 11 to 14 are about the lost sheep. And this is where, every time I've preached this before, I just go on to another theme like evangelism in general, but it's still about the children. And he talks about the lost sheep that goes astray. The shepherd leaves the 99, goes and finds the lost sheep. And then he says in verse, and when he finds it, there's more rejoicing over that lost sheep than over the other 99. But in verse 14, he says, neither is it the will of my Father who's in heaven that any of these little ones should perish. He's still talking about the little children. And ever since I did this message for the first time and really put it in the context of child abuse, I've referred to these folks as the lost sheep of Matthew 18. These are children who have been abused, many of them in a Christian setting. They have been rejected by the church. They have been shunned. They have been accused. They have been, burden after burden after burden laid on them. It's their fault. It's their guilt. And these sheep have left. These lambs have wandered away. And God is saying to us in that passage, you better go find them. Mm-hmm. Because I want them found. I want them brought back. In the church, young people are leaving our churches in droves.
Right.
And they've been doing it for generations. And I think abuse and how they've been treated after they've been abused is a huge reason why they're abandoning the faith.
Wow, that's brings a whole new meaning to those verses if you've never looked at it, which I have not. I mean, I've thought about the one with the millstone many times, but going on, that's really gives a lot of something to think about there. So, well, Dale, I want to thank you so much for joining us here today. What an interesting and impactful and important message you have. And I'd love to have you come back and let's talk some more about your ministry and your book and find out really what is going wrong and what could we do to make it right is really what I'd love to explore next. So thanks so much for joining me here today, and we'll see you next time here on Broken and Brilliant.